Hi, and welcome to Economics 221, section 9246 for the College Connect program. In this video, we are going to go over the course by doing a quick overview of the course content. And then specifically, we will talk about matters pertaining to chapter 1, to economics and life. The goal of this video is to help you with all the concepts presented in it and all of the different aspects that are going to be covered in homework number 1, as well as in an upcoming quiz number 1, and in your first discussion, which will center around the Business Insider video in your module number 1. Let me show you where that is. So as you go into the course, I hope you can see my Canvas setup. You'll see that after the set yourself up for success, that contains you're getting to know others as well as introduce yourself, so that you can then use the chat feature of the software in order to communicate with peers and support each other in your learning. You will move on to the module called chapter 1 module. In your textbook, Carlin, the chapter talks about the relationship between economics and life and introduces the chapter. There's a file, a PowerPoint slideshow that I'm about to open and that I will use for the remainder of this video. So you could read in the textbook. What the textbook suggests is the definition of economics and microeconomics. In my case, I'm going to treat economics as a social science. Social sciences are fact-based inquiry fields of knowledge that allow you to study society. So in the context of economics, we study human behavior, and human behavior consists of choices made by individuals. And in this particular context, we're going to be studying how individuals and collectives of individuals that organize themselves in many different ways. Sometimes they organize themselves as corporations. Sometimes these corporations are private. Sometimes these corporations are publicly traded companies, such as Tesla, for example. Sometimes they're private, like SpaceX. And they're collectives where people group together to create something of value that they wish to offer individuals in society, customers. And usually they require also securing resources and managing those resources, which is therefore how the Carlin definition of economics as the study of how people manage resources and my definition are pretty much complementary. They're not saying the same thing, they're essentially augmenting one another. Now, we're going to focus mostly on what are called private goods and services. Private goods and services are goods whose property rights are very clearly delineated and can be possessed by individuals without them having to deal with problems that other kinds of goods have, called public goods or common resources. My use of the atmosphere to breathe air does not preclude anybody else from using the same atmosphere. If I want to fly a drone for fun, I may or may not be interfering with other people's enjoyment of the same environment, who may like drones or may hate drones or may be flying their own drone in the same airspace, and that can lead to complications that explain why sometimes private goods have challenges, if not outright conflicts. But we're going to focus mostly on private goods, and we'll define those as time permits in later chapters. And we're going to talk mostly about the way in which society organizes the exchange of private goods, which is called markets. So we're going to talk about what a market is and clarify it and explain its powerful nature for private goods. And sometimes markets don't function very well when private goods have questionable property rights delineation. So what are you going to learn in this course? This course is a standard course. It's a the same curriculum throughout California. An introduction to microeconomics will describe the core principles that are covered primarily in chapter 1, such as scarcity, trade-offs, opportunity costs, and rational behavior. We'll talk more extensively about those and other details later in this video. For a complete list of the course outline, course goals, the 8 things that we're going to focus learning this semester, you can view this slide number 4 in your PowerPoints. What about chapter 1? Well, in chapter 1, your textbook introduces you to the notion of scarcity, opportunity cost, incentives, efficiency. What is scarcity about? Scarcity is about the absence of sufficient materials to satisfy all your wants. Okay, so scarcity is the condition in which you have a want of something material or something, whether this something material could be physical, like a piece of fruit or a new phone. Could also be intangible. It could be that you want to have a lot of people like you, or you want to have no one disliking you. Anything you want that you cannot get in sufficient abundance is what we would call a scarce resource. Scarcity is the condition of people's wants exceeding the availability of resources, be them private resources or public ones. Is drinking water a scarce resource? Think about that, for example. Is clean air a resource that is subject to scarcity? When a particular commodity is not subject to scarcity, the exception to scarcity is known as free disposal. So a free disposal condition means that you're looking at a particular material or intangible that exists in plenty of abundance, in which case its value is near zero, as we'll talk about at some point, especially if you ask me about it. What else is chapter 1 talking about? Well, scarcity is really important because it gives rise to people having to make choices that require trade-offs, choices in which we get something, but in order to do so, we must give something up. And those kinds of choices are referred to as choices made by a metric we call opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost concept in economics has to do with what is it that you give up for what you get. That's the simplest definition of opportunity cost. It's the value of what you gave up for what you ultimately decide you want. And in order to make opportunity cost-based decisions, we need to apply the principle of marginality or the principle of incrementalism. We need to be looking at the idea that when you are making an economic choice about one thing over another, when we are trading off and thus getting something of value in exchange for foregoing something else that also has value, that decision is made at the margin, holding everything else about our decision-making constant, a condition called ceteris paribus. One of the most important things about opportunity costs is that opportunity costs can vary. They can vary from individual to individual, and they can also vary by the conditions in which these costs are measured. And those kinds of, situations that we evaluate in which the conditions under the opportunity cost metrics occur vary is referred to as incentives. And so incentives could nudge people or can influence people to pursue more or less value in one exchange or another. And as you will see in your reading of chapter 1, incentives form a very important analysis of circumstantial variations in which people make decisions in. The last notion in chapter 1 of great importance is the notion of efficiency. Efficiency means that in many situations when we are dealing with people's decisions in this constrained environment of scarcity with other conditions that make people have certain valuations of one commodity for another, or of one thing for another, people are able to tweak these particular decisions, not just at the margin with respect to the trade-off at hand, but with respect to all trade-offs at the margin. And this is a condition known as efficiency. Efficiency refers to the fact that economic agents in behaving in social groups try to attain improvements, refined improvements based on exchange, based on how they interact with other people and trade one thing for another based on their opportunity cost valuations, which can vary depending on the incentives or conditions present in that environment. Last but not least, when we're talking about economic decision making in the small, when one person or one economic agent and another economic agent are being studied in their patterns and behavior with respect to how they view an exchange of commodities or of intangibles, we're going to be using certain tools that are really important. One of the tools we use, one of the thinking tools or philosophical tools we use is cause and effect, and we call that causality. So it's really important to understand causality, because when one thing causes another, then altering the cause will obviously reflect on the effect observed. And some people, though, get confused between cause and effect and a concept called correlation. Correlation simply means that two things seem to be related in their metrics of observation. Two things may be moving in the same direction, in which case we call that a positive correlation. And sometimes things change in value in inverse manners, and we would call that an inverse correlation. But just because things are positively or negatively correlated doesn't mean that one of the factors is really the cause and the other one is the effect. Correlation is not causation, and that's something really important to keep in mind when you're building ideas, economic arguments. The other set of tools that are really important is that there are two ways to analyze economic or microeconomic situations. One is called a positive analysis approach, or a positive analytical approach. The positive analytical approach refers to how one particular economic phenomenon under study actually is, how we observe it, how we see it. So it's a factful way of inquiry in economic work or in economic thought. The other way to analyze economics is in a normative analytical way. And the word normative comes from norms, and norms assume that there are valuations, or there are judgments, or there are preconceptions that could be cultural in nature, religious in nature, political in nature. So normative analysis in economics refers to those analyses about studying economic issues in the context of what is right and what is wrong, what could be better, what could be worse, what should be occurring, as opposed to the positive norm in analysis, or the positive approach of economic analysis, which refers to how things are, or how we measure them to be. We're going to be applying these tools of correlation, causality, and positive and normative analysis in models, because economic models are basically stories, and these stories are the structures we create for economic thinking. And the purpose of an economic model is to predict how things are going to be or how things ought to be, depending on whether it's a positive model or a normative model. From my point of view, models are essentially impacted by the nature of what we're talking about. Are we talking about a private good, or are we talking about a common resource like the atmosphere or rivers or air or water quality? Or are we talking about something called a club good? Are we talking about something that's only a few selective people can partake of, but outsiders can be excluded? Kind of like a condominium building or a country club, or or a team that you are a part of, a competitive soccer team. Maybe you play for the Mustangs in San Ramon Valley in a competitive soccer league. And if you're not in the team, you can't practice with the team. You can't play with the team. So those kinds of goods are called club goods. The other factor that influences models is information and who knows what. And in many, many economic situations, the reality is that we have what's called asymmetry of information. Some people or some economic agents have more knowledge than others. Some economic agents have more facts, more access to facts surrounding an economy than others. Some individuals have more resources than others, and thus can acquire more information than others. Some people can actually introduce dirty information. So they can actually lie or deceive people into believing something that isn't the case through propaganda. And that can create asymmetries or differentials in the outcomes of predictions from these models. So we'll try to evaluate some of these things. For example, during COVID-19, nobody wants to say, I have COVID, because especially no one out at a 4th of July picnic. Because what the heck are you doing at a 4th of July picnic if you do have COVID? You should be socially isolating and socially responsible, but if you don't care about other people in society, you'd just be out and about, and you don't think it's a big deal because you don't think you could kill anybody. Though the reality is you might be able to infect someone who is vulnerable in society, and you might hurt them. And so, in your zeal to have more, you could create circumstances that affect others super adversely, like in the contagion example that I just worked on. Scarcity also affects models. The degree and extent of scarcity is an important thing. At several times during the history of the world, we've had people say, the world population is too big. We need to curb the world population in some nihilistic way. So if you look at in the 19th century, you'll see a lot of literature on world population being completely out of control. But all of a sudden we had an industrial revolution, and we could mechanize agriculture and produce way more food and support way more people on the planet than ever before in the 1900s. And now we actually support 11 billion people on the planet, not 800 million people on the planet. So over time, our notions of scarcity and our metrics of scarcity are altered by the scale of abundance of what we didn't know we had in the form of natural resources or ingenuity that innovated into the ability to support more human life in the planet. And the last important feature of models is cultural parameters. Cultural parameters are basically the values that individuals in a social environment share. For example, in California, one of the things that really endeared me to California was in traveling when I was a young man, a young immigrant into California, the use of the word dude. Everybody was like, what's up, dude? Hey, dude. And it just gave you a sense of informality and a sense of calmness, where there was no pretense, vanity wasn't so important, showing off wasn't so important, pretending to be something you're not was not so important. So it gives that sense that in California, people are more genuine about their life, and thus more humble in many ways. And so that's what I mean by a cultural parameter. You know, how humble are people in a country versus how prideful they are? How much do people care about showing off status by some social strata, like some social characteristic, like in, you know, in a lot of Latin American cultures where I'm from, your last name, it's a huge deal because you're from that family or this family. So it creates strata, social strata that divides people into so-called having a more privileged social or a less privileged social background. But in California, you don't have that. It's a very flat social structure because everybody's a dude, so to speak. The same can impact you know, the structure of buying and selling. So that's why cultural parameters can arise from how we interact as individuals, as buyers and sellers, as people who care about others versus not. In some cultures, you know, people might go around not putting masks on because they frankly don't believe the masks will keep anybody safe. Or they use that as an excuse not to wear a mask in public during COVID-19, during a pandemic, because they don't want to, because it infringes on their individual freedom. Whereas in other places, even if people don't like to wear a mask, they know that they should wear a mask when they're in public so that they minimize the probability that they could hurt a neighbor, a citizen peer, somebody who is as valuable in that society as themselves. And so those kinds of cultural parameters influence the kind of model that you build to think about value and exchange and how individuals interact with commodities and with intangibles, with goods and with services. To start, we're going to make some assumptions, and those assumptions are called the economic rationality assumptions. And the economic rationality assumptions that we start with, among them are, we assume that information is symmetrical and that it's complete. So we're not assuming that in these economic models you can keep something of importance in the determination of value from a customer or from a producer. So we call that perfect and complete information. So we're going to assume that. We're going to assume that people have the cognitive ability to check out all choices and rationalize any given opportunity cost metric around those choices. And that that people are trying to achieve the best for themselves in terms of creating an acquisition portfolio of goods and services that offers them the highest possible valuation for themselves. And that collection of assumptions is what we call a rational economic agent. And we're going to be building models from the perspective that asks 4 questions. First of all, what is the economic agent's goal? And what are the economic agent's constraints around that goal? What kind of parameters bring scarcity to light in the goal acquisition? Second of all, what kinds of trade-offs are these individuals looking at as important to their benefit maximization? Thirdly is, how will other economic agents react and respond in light of this behavior? Because they're also seeking the best for themselves. And fourth of all, why isn't everybody doing the same thing in a situation like that? Why do different people do different things? Okay. So that'll be the focus and attention on of chapter 1, applying those concepts to situations and circumstances. If you've already done homework 1, then you kind of have a sense what I mean by that. So if you haven't done homework 1, do so. In addition, I'm going to be posting for September 2 or September 3 deadline quiz 1. And I'm also going to be completing a set of prompts so that as you watch the video that is included in your Carlin, the video on scarcity. What is scarcity? I'm clicking on it right now. It's a video from Business Insider, and Business Insider has these mini documentaries which are sort of interesting sometimes. In this case, we're going to be looking at a wood called agar wood, and agar wood is a super expensive wood that is highly aromatic, and it produces some extraordinarily valuable aromatics and oils. And so I won't spoil the video by not doing it justice. Just watch it. And after watching the video, you could go to the discussions section sometime, probably Monday next week. And I will put a series of prompts about the video that I would like to discuss so that you can earn the discussion points on this particular subject matter. The video is not just about scarcity. So this is not a simple, the wood is super scarce and that's why it's super expensive. There are a lot of intricacies in why agar wood is so expensive. Watch the video. And I hope you enjoyed chapter 1. I hope you really like it. Take care.